Keith Martell is the president and chief executive officer of First Nations Bank of Canada and of FMB Trust. Now, he's originally from the Waterhen Lake First Nation in Northwest Saskatchewan, and he's a graduate from the University of Saskatchewan in 1985 with a BCom. He worked with the chartered accounting firm KPMG for 10 years, and for 5 years, between 1995 and 2000, he served the Federation of Saskatchewan Indian Nations as the executive director of finance and fiscal relations. And he was instrumental in the creation of First Nations Bank of Canada. He serves on a number of boards, including as a former member of the board of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. And he's also currently a member of the Board of Governors of the University of Saskatchewan, from whom he received an honorary Doctor of Laws in 2016. Keith, welcome. We're delighted to have you with Canada 360.
Thank you, Perrin. It's great to see you.
Well, let's start by situating ourselves here as it relates to Indigenous communities. What sort of COVID-induced changes have there been as a result of this? What's been the experience that First Nations have had as a result of COVID?
Yeah, I think, the key thing is some of the issues that all Canadians faced. So, the COVID crisis in Indigenous communities, especially remote northern Indigenous communities, stopped travel, created a need for people to stay at home. And that was just a greater risk in the Indigenous communities, because when you stay at home, a lot of those communities, it's not a single family, it's multiple families. The overcrowding of housing in a lot of those communities. Lack of travel for people in the South meant you had to have your, restaurant meals and your, Amazon packages delivered to your home. That's not an option in northern communities. So, effectively, if you're in Glulik or Waskaganish or any of those northern communities, you need to go to the northern store or the Arctic Co-op in order to get your food. You can't have it delivered. So those kind of services that we took for granted that changed our life down here significantly changed the life for the North. Now, two things: isolation helped, because of course if they could keep outsiders out, they were safe, and many communities did a pretty good job of that. But any kind of trade people coming in, people coming in for services, those kind of things created a risk for the community, and they had zero local capacity for healthcare, which just made the risk exponentially larger than we faced in the South. So why is that a business issue? Well, it created an opportunity for businesses to figure out how they can do things differently, but unfortunately, a lot of that required connectivity, which there isn't in the North. And it also then created an understanding that these communities are at risk, and if they want to participate in the modern economy, they have to get some of the things we take for granted down south, which that's part of all our problem to figure out.
So all of the problems that we would see in the other communities, plus a number of unique problems as a result
Right.
of isolation and geography on top of everything else, and lack of services.
Absolutely.
And indeed, in many cases, I suppose, people would be working outside of the community with non-Indigenous businesses, and there would be a concern about them bringing back disease into the community as well.
Yeah, absolutely. But, and then, the opportunities also arose like we're seeing everywhere else. Like, geography is not so critical to where you do your work anymore. I don't know about you, but, over the last 8 months, I've had, 2 or 3 kids and girlfriends who were working elsewhere who've come to our home and are working out of our living room. But for a while there, we had 3 different businesses working in our house. And that was possible because of connectivity. And, I hate to keep coming back to that, but, Indigenous communities, because of their isolation, because of the talent there that's underutilized, I think a lot of communities saw an opportunity to have more people live in their communities and, write or do their artwork or, consult for groups everywhere in the world. But the real risk in those communities is that you can't get to the outside world once you're there. So even though there's a risk there, I think people observe the opportunity. If we can get these communities connected, we can bring them better healthcare, better education, job opportunities that we brought to everybody else's home in Canada. We can do that in the North as well, and turn more dependent communities into communities that are contributors.
That really anticipates the next question I wanted to ask you, and that was what COVID-induced changes either increase the opportunities or the risks for Indigenous economic development. You mentioned the expansion of digital services and the ability for people to work and to receive services in remote areas, and yet
Right.
that's still very fragmentary in Canada today. But even the base that we have today has been helpful during this, obviously. What do you see as the both the threats and the opportunities here as a result of what we've seen?
Yeah, I think, from my view, a lot of the opportunities for Indigenous business, Indigenous communities to become more economically independent, the opportunities haven't changed. I think some of the risks have changed with COVID. So one of the big risks, that we've all faced is the ability of governments to continue to support the recovery through this crisis. And for most Canadians, that's issues with support programs and business support programs and individual support, unemployment insurance. All those issues are important for Canada to get through this crisis, and I think that's great that the governments have done what they need to do to get us past this. The problem is Indigenous communities are overly dependent on government transfers. So I believe that the fiscal challenges that Canada is going to face coming out of this are going to be even a greater challenge for communities that are very dependent on Canadian fiscal support. So transfers from Canada for many communities is a lion's share of the social and economic support in the communities. So I think the First Nations and Indigenous communities are understanding that right now they're being supported, but what's going to be Canada's capacity to support them going forward, which is a great opportunity, frankly, to break the chain from Canadian support for business development in the North. For a very long time, I've really been an advocate of, Professors Carlton Cornell with Harvard did a study a long time ago about what makes, at that time, Indian reservations in the U.S. economically successful. And they looked at two approaches. One was sort of only focusing on jobs and income. So how can we, create jobs through government programs or get some income into people's hands, as opposed to the alternative, which they called nation building. And it's really about creating an environment where business can succeed. And the First Nations, the Inuit communities that we see that are successful, understand that it's not just about creating one job by, through government programs, but it's about creating sustainable businesses. And, the kinds of things that they need to do, be proactive. No disrespect to government folks, but often they go where the puck was. Whereas, business goes to what the opportunities are today. And especially as we change the environment because of COVID, Indigenous communities have to, finance like business does, operate like business does, be successful like business is. And more Indigenous communities are understanding that. And those are the ones that are successful that we work with a lot. And they understand that, government coming in and saying, here's something that we think you should invest in, or, this looks like a good ribbon cutting opportunity, may not be the real opportunity here. It's about seeing what you're good at, proactively, what makes sense for your community, your region. And if we get some of these other things, like I talked about before, fixed, like connectivity, they've got tons of opportunity to move forward successfully.
The principle is no different than it is for the rest of Canadian society, that we need to find a way of ensuring that people can be self-sufficient and that they have sustainable economic activity, that they're not dependent upon constant flow of money from government. But it's a problem with roots that are far deeper within First Nations and other communities, and where much more needs to be done to ensure the capacity for self-sufficiency.
Right. Education, healthcare, basic services that we take for granted. If we can improve those in those communities, I think there's people who are hungry for a better life and greater opportunity. And the fact that now we're all working from wherever in the world, isolation sometimes now is an added benefit for communities. Those kind of things. I think Canadians have more empathy. I think we understand what the impact is of putting all our people who need care into one home somewhere. We understand the risk of a community without any local health services. And I think now that Canadians maybe have some empathy towards those issues, they can understand how First Nations or, Indigenous communities in the North are really in a position where they're vulnerable. But if we fix some of those things, I think there are opportunities for all of us to gain. The Indigenous community is better off, and Canada's better off when they're better off. And I think we all live in the same country. And if we can increase the economic returns for all of us, including Indigenous people, we're all better off.
My final question flows directly from that. We hear a lot of discussion about the importance of infrastructure as we look at a business-led recovery.
Right.
Infrastructure can take two forms. The first is obviously physical, and the other is social. Can you discuss from the perspective of Indigenous communities, what sort of infrastructure investment should be made by government at this point to allow us to move from the subsidies-based economy that we have right now in Canada to one where both families and businesses can be more autonomous again?
Yeah, that's really important, and I hate to keep harping on it because I'm going to sound like an IT internet guy, but connectivity is the infrastructure that we need to do. And in so many communities, we do banking in a lot of northern communities, Indigenous communities, and if you use an online banking app in some of those communities, your screen times out before you actually approve a transaction. So, everybody talks about, well, why don't you just use internet banking like everybody else in Canada? Well, it's just, there's no electronic highway for them to get on and to ride to an economic future. And so, that has to get fixed. Some of that's going to fix some of the other issues. I've always said, the best thing government can do for economic development in Indigenous communities is get K-12 right, get basic education right. And people will take advantage of that and be successful. If we have connectivity, we can bring the best education from anywhere in the world to these Indigenous communities, which is a big advantage. So I think we've got to fix that issue first, and with that will come some more economic prosperity. We'll fix the housing issues, we'll fix the water issues, infrastructure, but we've got to start with them being able to connect to the basic services we take for granted.
Keith, thank you. It's an ambitious agenda for governments and for the rest of us to be following as we look at recovery from COVID, but it's one that's absolutely critical for all Canadians and certainly for Indigenous communities. Thanks so much for being with us today.
Great, thanks, Perrin. I know the Chamber's always been a big advocate for these issues and moving this forward, and I thank you for the opportunity to talk to you today.